Then vote to erase us from the galaxy, Jonathan Mercer said quietly. But do not mistake our silence for surrender. No one in the Grand Chamber expected the human ambassador to speak those words without raising his voice. They expected anger. They expected threats. They expected another desperate plea from the newest civilization sitting beneath the towering banners of the High Council. Instead, the room filled with a silence that somehow felt louder than the Chancellor's speech. The circular chamber overlooked an endless field of stars, each represented by a glowing marker suspended above the polished black floor. Delegates from hundreds of worlds watched from elevated galleries, while cameras carried every second of the hearing across known space. At the highest platform stood High Chancellor Magnus Kaler, his silver ceremonial robes flowing behind him as though gravity itself respected his authority. He rested both hands on the carved podium and looked down at Jonathan with calm confidence. "The Council has reached a unanimous decision," Kaler declared. "Humanity has repeatedly ignored Council directives, interfered with protected sectors, and demonstrated a reckless willingness to act without authorization. Effective immediately, Earth loses its voting privileges. Human shipyards will be placed under Council supervision. Military expansion is prohibited for 100 standard years." A low murmur swept through the chamber. Some delegates nodded with satisfaction. Others looked away. Everyone understood what this meant. Humanity had just been pushed from partner to dependent in a single vote. Jonathan remained perfectly still. His navy blue suit looked almost plain among the elaborate uniforms surrounding him. He slowly closed the leather notebook resting on the desk, capped the fountain pen he always carried, and glanced once toward the enormous windows where sunlight reflected off distant station rings. Behind him, his deputy, Claire Donovan, leaned forward just enough to whisper, "They're waiting for you to fight." Jonathan answered without looking back. "No, they're waiting for me to lose control." Kaler smiled. "Does the representative from Earth wish to contest the ruling?" Every camera focused on Jonathan. Across millions of screens, people expected history to erupt into chaos. Jonathan stood, straightened the cuff of his jacket, and calmly met the Chancellor's eyes. "No, Chancellor," he replied. "I understand your decision." Even the translators hesitated before repeating his words. Counselor Celine Voss frowned from across the chamber. She had watched enough negotiations to recognize when someone was hiding fear. This was not fear. It was certainty. She leaned toward Kaler and spoke under her breath. "He is too calm." Kaler dismissed her concern with a slight wave of his hand. Humans always posture before they compromise. Jonathan gathered his notebook and briefcase. Nothing about his movements suggested defeat. He paused beside Claire, who quietly asked, "What happens now?" Jonathan allowed himself the faintest smile. "Now," he said, "they enjoy their victory." Without another word, he walked across the chamber. No dramatic exit. No angry speech. Only the steady sound of polished shoes against stone. The great doors opened. They closed behind him with a deep echo that lingered longer than anyone expected. Around the chamber, conversations slowly resumed, but they carried an uneasy edge. Celine continued watching the sealed doors. Something about that departure refused to sit right with her. Kaler, meanwhile, addressed the assembly with visible satisfaction. "Let today stand as proof that no civilization is above council law." Applause spread through the galleries. Some delegates joined enthusiastically. Others hesitated before clapping. None of them noticed that Jonathan had left one thing behind. Resting neatly on the polished desk where he had been sitting was a single blank page from his notebook. At the bottom, written in careful handwriting, were only 6 words. "History always invoices borrowed arrogance later." Jonathan Mercer did not speak again until the shuttle had cleared the council station and the enormous ring of the capital world had become nothing more than a bright arc against the darkness. Claire Donovan finally broke the silence. "I have known you for 12 years, Jonathan." That was not the face of a man who just lost. Jonathan kept looking through the window. "Because we did not." Claire frowned. "They stripped away everything." "No," Jonathan answered. "They stripped away the illusion that they ever intended to treat us as equals." The shuttle slipped into hyperspace, leaving the council behind. Less than 40 minutes later, inside a secure command room beneath the Pentagon, President Rebecca Hayes watched the final recording from the hearing without saying a single word. Around the long table sat Admiral Nathan Brooks, Secretary of Defense Laura Bennett, National Security Director Daniel Cross, and several senior advisors who had spent decades preparing for scenarios that everyone hoped would never happen. When the recording ended, the room remained silent. Rebecca folded her hands. Any objections? Nobody answered. Brooks slowly pushed a thin black folder toward the center of the table. The cover contained only 2 words. Project Retribution. Rebecca looked around the room one last time. Confirm every condition. Daniel opened another file. Unauthorized seizure of Terran commercial assets. He checked the first box. Confirmed. Laura continued. Suspension of sovereign voting rights. Another box. Confirmed. Brooks spoke next. Preparation for foreign military oversight of Earth shipyards. Another check. Rebecca nodded once. Then they have crossed every red line our predecessors warned them never to cross. Brooks slid a secure tablet across the table. Authorization. Rebecca placed her thumb against the encrypted scanner. A soft green light appeared. Authorization granted. Thousands of miles away, buried beneath granite in the Rocky Mountains, lights flickered on inside a facility that officially did not exist. Engineers stopped mid-conversation as sealed vault doors unlocked for the first time in over 2 centuries. Computer systems disconnected from civilian networks and shifted to isolated command architecture. No alarms sounded. No speeches were made. Every technician simply went back to work as if they had rehearsed this day their entire careers. Back at the council station, High Chancellor Magnus Kaler stood before reporters wearing the satisfied smile of a politician convinced history had chosen his side. Humanity has accepted the authority of the High Council, he declared. The transition will be peaceful. Questions poured in from journalists representing dozens of worlds. One reporter asked whether Earth might appeal the ruling. Kaler almost laughed. They understand the consequences of resistance. Standing near the back of the briefing room, Counselor Celine Voss felt a knot forming in her stomach. She replayed Jonathan's final expression over and over. It did not look like surrender. It looked like someone leaving a meeting early because another appointment mattered more. She quietly contacted her intelligence office. I want continuous monitoring of every Terran communication channel. The analyst on the other end hesitated. There is almost nothing to monitor. What do you mean? Their diplomatic traffic has stopped. Military traffic has stopped. Commercial traffic has dropped by nearly 80% in less than 1 hour. It is as if someone turned off an entire civilization. Celine stared through the enormous windows toward the distant stars where Sol was hidden beyond countless jump lanes. Civilizations did not simply become quiet, not unless they were terrified or preparing. At that same moment, Jonathan's shuttle touched down inside Andrew's Space Force base. As the hatch opened, Admiral Brooks was already waiting beside an unmarked vehicle. Neither man shook hands. Brooks simply looked at Jonathan and asked one question. Did they believe it? Jonathan glanced back toward the sky where the council station could no longer be seen. Every single one of them. Brooks opened the vehicle door. Good. As they drove toward the underground command complex, a secure satellite network transmitted one encrypted message to every classified Terran installation across human space. It contained only 4 words. Phase 1 is now active. For the next 3 days, the High Council celebrated what every major news network called the most decisive political victory in modern galactic history. Commentators praised Chancellor Magnus Kaler for bringing humanity under control without firing a single shot. Markets across the core systems climbed. Shipping companies rushed to bid on contracts that had once belonged to Terran corporations. Diplomats toasted to what they believed was the beginning of a more orderly galaxy. Kaler welcomed every compliment with the confidence of a man who believed history had already chosen its winner. During a closed executive session, he stood before a holographic map of human territory while senior council members watched from their seats. The first inspection fleets will arrive at the Terran shipyards within 72 hours, Kaler announced. Earth has already accepted our authority. They understand resistance is pointless. Several counselors nodded. Others quietly reviewed financial projections showing enormous profits from newly regulated Terran industries. Only Celine Voss remained unconvinced. She had spent the previous night reading intelligence reports that refused to make sense. Every transmission leaving the Sol system had become brief, heavily encrypted, or disappeared entirely. Civilian freight routes had been canceled without explanation. Human ambassadors stationed across Allied worlds had quietly returned home. None of those actions violated Council law, yet together they formed a pattern that unsettled her. She finally spoke. "Mr. Chancellor, I recommend delaying asset seizures until we understand why every Terran diplomatic office has gone silent." Kaler barely looked up. Silence is exactly what defeated civilizations produce. "Respectfully," Celine replied. "Fear sounds different." A few delegates exchanged uneasy glances. Kaler folded his hands behind his back. "Councillor Voss, humanity builds excellent machines and negotiates respectable trade agreements. They are not master strategists. They lost the vote. Now they are saving face." The discussion moved on. Minutes later, the Council approved emergency authority allowing inspectors to assume administrative control over 3 major Terran logistics hubs outside the Sol system. Orders were transmitted immediately. Across the galaxy, Council officials prepared to replace human administrators with their own personnel. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of Earth, Jonathan Mercer entered a secure operations center unlike anything most elected officials even knew existed. Massive digital displays stretched across the room, each showing hundreds of supply routes instead of military formations. Cargo schedules, manufacturing networks, energy distribution, agricultural exports, medical shipments. Every line connected to another until the entire galaxy resembled a living nervous system. Admiral Nathan Brooks stood beside the largest display. "Most governments think power comes from fleets," he said. "It never did." Jonathan studied the network in silence. "How long before they notice?" Brooks gave a faint smile. "They already noticed. They just misread what they saw." Rebecca Hayes joined them carrying a cup of black coffee. "Inspection teams are moving toward our facilities." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly as expected." Rebecca placed the cup on the table and looked at every senior officer in the room. "No interference. No threats. No public statements. We stay invisible." One young analyst hesitated before speaking. "Madam President, people are asking why we are not responding." Rebecca answered without hesitation. "Because the loudest move is rarely the strongest one." Thousands of miles away, the first Council inspection convoy dropped out of hyperspace near a Terran commercial station. Its commander confidently transmitted standard docking authorization. Instead of receiving clearance, every screen aboard his flagship displayed the same polite message. Terran Commerce Authority. Facility temporarily unavailable. Estimated reopening time unavailable. Thank you for your patience. The commander frowned. Scan the station. His sensor officer looked up in confusion. "Sir, there is nothing wrong with the station." "Then why is nobody answering?" The officer swallowed. "Because there is nobody there." 72 hours after the Council vote, the first inspection convoy crossed into Terran-controlled space, expecting an orderly transfer of authority. Instead, they found silence. The navigation beacons were working. The stations had power. Docking lights flashed exactly on schedule. Yet every corridor visible through the observation ports was empty. Commander Relkin stared at the main display. "Run another life scan." His sensor officer checked the results twice before answering. No civilian personnel. No maintenance crews. No security teams. The station was evacuated with remarkable precision. Without a distress call, Relkin asked, "Yes, sir." Back on the Council capital, Chancellor Magnus Kaler dismissed the report before the briefing had even finished. "Then humanity is making our job easier," he said with a satisfied smile. "Take possession of every abandoned facility." Celine Voss folded her arms. "Or they are deciding which pieces they no longer need." Kaler ignored the warning. Within the hour, inspection teams spread across multiple Terran logistics hubs, attaching Council seals to warehouses, fuel depots, and administrative offices. Cameras broadcast officials proudly replacing Terran flags with Council banners. Across the galaxy, commentators praised the operation as another flawless demonstration of centralized authority. On Earth, nobody reacted publicly. Deep inside the command complex, Jonathan Mercer stood beside President Rebecca Hayes and Admiral Nathan Brooks as live feeds from every occupied station appeared across a wall of displays. Brooks calmly reviewed the data. "Inspection teams have entered all designated facilities." Rebecca looked toward Jonathan. "Any unexpected movement?" Jonathan slowly shook his head. Exactly according to schedule. One operations officer hesitated before speaking. Madam President, they are celebrating on every network. Rebecca smiled faintly. Let them finish celebrating. At that exact moment, a council engineering crew attempted to activate the primary logistics interface aboard Station 12. The terminal accepted every security credential. Every command appeared valid. Then a simple message filled the screen. Ownership transferred. Local systems retired. Thank you for your years of partnership. The lights dimmed briefly before every automated cargo crane powered down in perfect sequence. One after another, warehouse doors locked themselves. Inventory records disappeared from the local servers because they had never been stored there in the first place. The data had already been relocated weeks earlier. Bring the systems back online, Relkin ordered. Engineers rushed from console to console, but every machine responded the same way. Operational authority unavailable. Contact manufacturer. Find the manufacturer, Relkin snapped. An uneasy silence settled over the bridge. Sir, the communications officer answered, the manufacturer is Terran Industrial Systems. Then call them. We cannot. Why not? Every communication address has been deactivated. Similar reports began arriving from station after station. Fuel pumps refused new authorization. Cargo elevators entered permanent maintenance mode. Navigation processors switched into protected archival status. Nothing had been damaged. Nothing had been sabotaged. Everything had simply stopped working for anyone except the people who had built it. Frustration spread quickly. During one inspection, a nervous security officer forced open an equipment vault, hoping to bypass the automated controls. Instead of weapons or hidden defenses, he found neatly organized shelves that had already been emptied. Every tool had been removed months before. Every spare component had vanished. Even the instruction manuals were gone. Hours later, emergency calls flooded the council capital. Freight schedules slipped behind by minutes, then hours. Passenger terminals reported unexpected delays. Manufacturing worlds requested replacement software that no longer existed. Kaler slammed his hand against the conference table. They cannot shut down an economy without firing a shot. Celine looked directly at him before answering. Maybe they never intended to fight the economy. Maybe they built it. Across the room, every incoming status display changed from green to yellow almost at the same time. And for the first time since the vote, nobody inside the High Council chamber looked confident. The first signs of panic did not come from politicians. They came from ordinary cargo captains waiting outside orbital ports that no longer knew where to send them. Hundreds of freighters drifted in carefully spaced holding patterns while dispatchers repeated the same answer over and over. Please stand by. We are waiting for updated routing. The updates never came. Across the council network, logistics companies reported delays measured in minutes, then hours. Food shipments missed transfer windows. Medical supplies sat inside climate-controlled containers because automated customs systems refused to generate release codes. Every problem looked small by itself. Together they spread through the galaxy like cracks beneath clear ice. Inside the High Council Operations Center, giant displays filled with flashing notifications. Chancellor Magnus Kaler walked in expecting another routine briefing. Instead, senior administrators were already arguing. What is happening? He demanded. A transportation director stepped forward. Freight coordination has dropped by 27% across the core routes. Another official interrupted. Energy distribution forecasts are becoming unreliable because predictive software is no longer updating. Restart the systems, Kaler ordered. We have tried, the official replied. The systems are running. They simply are not receiving the information they were designed to expect. Celine Voss quietly studied the incoming reports. Ask one question, she said. Who maintained these networks before today? The room became silent as technicians searched through decades of contracts. One analyst finally looked up. Terran Infrastructure Consortium. Another searched deeper. Navigation optimization. Terran. Commercial scheduling. Terran. Supply chain forecasting. Terran. Emergency logistics recovery. Also Terran. Kaler frowned. Replace them. The analyst swallowed. With whom? Thousands of light years away, inside the underground command center beneath the Pentagon, Admiral Nathan Brooks watched identical reports appear on a secure display. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. Rebecca Hayes looked around the room. Civilian impact? A policy advisor answered immediately. Minimal inside soul. External disruptions are increasing exactly as projected. Jonathan Mercer folded his hands. Issue humanitarian exemptions. Brooks nodded. Already transmitted. Human-controlled relief channels quietly remained available for hospitals, rescue services, and civilian emergency requests. Luxury freight, political shipments, and council administrative traffic stayed offline. Rebecca glanced toward Jonathan. Some will call this retaliation. Jonathan calmly answered. No, this is separation. They voted to govern without us. We are simply allowing them to try. At that moment, an urgent transmission reached the council chamber from an industrial world famous for manufacturing starship reactors. Its governor appeared exhausted. Our production lines have stopped. Kaler stared in disbelief. Your facilities are fully powered. Yes, the governor replied. But every calibration program was licensed through Terran engineering partners. We cannot certify a single reactor without their verification systems. More calls arrived before the first one ended. A farming coalition reported that autonomous harvest schedules had frozen. A medical alliance could not synchronize pharmaceutical deliveries. Even banking institutions warned that interstellar settlement times were increasing by the hour because optimization algorithms had quietly disappeared from their networks. Kaler finally turned toward Celine. Why would humanity build systems they could take away? Celine answered with a calm voice that somehow carried through the entire chamber. I do not think they built them to take away. I think they built them because everyone trusted them. Before anyone could respond, every display in the operations center refreshed simultaneously. A new alert appeared across every screen. Strategic fuel reserves across 12-member systems had fallen below emergency planning thresholds, and for the first time since the council had celebrated its victory, every person in that room understood they were no longer managing an inconvenience. They were watching the foundation beneath an entire civilization begin to shift. By the beginning of the fifth day, the crisis had stopped looking temporary. Freight lanes that had once carried millions of tons of cargo every hour now moved at a fraction of their normal pace. Fuel depots remained stocked, yet distribution schedules failed one after another because the predictive systems that balanced supply across hundreds of worlds were no longer responding. Long lines of transport vessels stretched for miles outside orbital stations, their captains waiting for instructions that never arrived. Inside the High Council chamber, the confident voices from only a few days earlier had disappeared. Every meeting now began with another emergency report. Magnus Kaler stood before the central display, refusing to accept what every advisor was trying to tell him. This is economic pressure, he said sharply. Nothing more. Humanity expects us to panic. A transportation minister answered carefully. With respect, Chancellor, several frontier colonies have already begun rationing industrial fuel. Then reroute additional shipments. We cannot. The routing network no longer predicts safe transfer windows. Kaler turned toward another advisor. Use military logistics. The officer lowered his eyes. Military logistics depended on the same optimization network. The room fell silent. Celine Voss finally broke it. We keep speaking as though these systems belong to us. They never did. Kaler looked at her with open frustration. Enough. If humanity wants to play this game, we will remind them who governs this galaxy. He activated a secure channel. Moments later, commanders from the Council Defense Fleet appeared above the conference table as blue holograms. Effective immediately, Kaler announced. All Terran commercial facilities operating beyond the Sol system are to be seized under emergency authority. Every warehouse, every refinery, every manufacturing center. If they refuse cooperation, remove their administrators and place council personnel in charge. Several fleet commanders exchanged uncertain glances, but none challenged the order. Within hours, council security forces arrived at dozens of Terran-operated facilities. The operation began smoothly. Gates opened. Security checkpoints offered no resistance. Offices were empty. Automated systems politely granted temporary access. Commander Relkin walked through one of the largest logistics centers in the Orion corridor, almost disappointed by how easy the takeover seemed. This is it, one officer asked. I expected protests. Relkin looked around the spotless control room. So did I. He approached the master operations console and entered his authorization code. The display illuminated immediately. A welcome message appeared, followed by a single line. Administrative authority accepted. Local expertise unavailable. Estimated training period, 11 years, for months. The officers stared in disbelief. This has to be a joke, someone muttered. They opened equipment lockers expecting technical manuals. Every shelf was empty. Maintenance drones remained docked but inactive because their operating licenses required certified Terran supervisors. Automated forklifts sat motionless. Assembly robots waited for encrypted work orders that no longer existed. Every machine was intact. Every system had power. Nothing was broken. Yet nothing could function. Reports from other seized facilities arrived within minutes, each sounding almost identical. Everywhere the Council had claimed control, they had inherited buildings instead of capability. Back on Earth, Jonathan Mercer quietly listened as Admiral Nathan Brooks reviewed the incoming intelligence. They took every location we expected. Jonathan nodded. And now? Brooks allowed himself the smallest smile. Now they finally understand the difference between owning something and knowing how it works. Before anyone could say another word, an urgent transmission reached the High Council. Several member worlds had begun demanding immediate leadership changes, while multiple regional governors announced they would ignore new council directives unless essential commerce was restored within 48 hours. Kaler looked around the chamber and realized the challenge before him was no longer coming from humanity. It was coming from the very alliance he believed he completely controlled. The pressure inside the High Council no longer came from outside its walls. It came from every seat inside the chamber. Governors who had praised Magnus Kaler only days before were now demanding answers that nobody could provide. Entire sectors reported slowing commerce. Passenger terminals filled with stranded travelers. Manufacturing schedules slipped further behind each hour. None of it looked dramatic on its own, but together it felt like watching a clock slowly stop ticking. Kaler refused to show uncertainty. He stood before the assembly and raised his voice with the confidence that had carried him through decades of political victories. The Council will restore order. Humanity cannot hold the galaxy hostage forever. Before the applause could begin, another advisor hurried into the chamber carrying a secure data tablet. He whispered something into the Chancellor's ear. Kaler's expression changed for only a fraction of a second, but Celine Voss noticed. "Report it," she said. The advisor hesitated. 3 independent member systems have signed temporary trade agreements directly with Earth without requesting Council approval. A wave of uneasy conversations swept across the room. Kaler slammed his hand onto the podium. "Those agreements are illegal," Celine calmly replied. "Perhaps they are simply desperate." On Earth, Jonathan Mercer sat across from President Rebecca Hayes inside the same underground command center where every incoming report appeared in real time. Rebecca looked toward a map showing hundreds of worlds. More blue markers were appearing every hour. "They are reaching out on their own," she observed. Jonathan nodded. "Not because they support us. Because they need stability." Admiral Nathan Brooks walked in carrying a fresh intelligence summary. "Private channels only. They are asking for software support, maintenance teams, and logistics advisors." Rebecca looked at Jonathan. "Do we answer?" Jonathan did not hesitate. "Yes. Every humanitarian request, every civilian request, every hospital, every rescue operation. No political conditions." Brooks smiled slightly. "Exactly what they will not expect." Across the galaxy, Terran engineers quietly returned essential services to isolated communities one agreement at a time. Water purification systems came back online. Medical deliveries resumed. Emergency navigation software was restored for civilian transport. No speeches accompanied the effort. No cameras followed the teams. People simply noticed that when they called Earth directly, someone answered. Inside the council chamber, frustration turned into open disagreement. Several delegates demanded negotiations before conditions became worse. Others insisted on harsher measures. Kaler rejected every proposal that sounded like compromise. "If we invite Jonathan Mercer back now," he declared, "we admit weakness before the entire galaxy." Celine leaned forward. "The galaxy already sees weakness. The only question is whether it also sees wisdom." Kaler ignored her and issued one final order. "Deploy the Council Defense Fleet to the edge of the Sol system. We will demonstrate that authority still belongs to this Council." Hours later, Dozens of Council warships assembled with flawless precision before making the jump toward human space. Their arrival was broadcast across countless worlds. Citizens watched enormous cruisers emerge from hyperspace exactly as expected. Then the fleet stopped. Engines remained operational. Weapons remained offline. Navigation officers exchanged confused looks. "Report," the flagship commander demanded. His chief engineer answered with visible disbelief. "Fuel reserves are lower than projected." "That is impossible. We completed replenishment yesterday." "Yes, sir. But the optimization schedules that coordinated our refueling network were written and maintained by Terran contractors. Half the support tankers never reached the rendezvous point because they were following outdated routing models." The commander stared at the tactical display as ship after ship requested revised fuel calculations. The fleet had not been defeated. It had simply arrived unprepared. Back inside the High Council chamber, an emergency transmission filled the central screen. Every delegate watched in complete silence as the flagship commander delivered a sentence nobody imagined hearing. "Mr. Chancellor, with current reserves, the fleet cannot continue toward Sol without risking its return journey." For the first time since the vote against humanity, Magnus Kaler had no immediate answer. The emergency transmission from the stranded Council fleet spread through government channels long before the public ever heard about it. Inside the High Council chamber, nobody rushed to speak. The silence itself had become unsettling. Magnus Kaler slowly dismissed the fleet commander from the display, then turned toward his advisors as if expecting someone else to solve the problem for him. Nobody did. One minister finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Chancellor, if the fleet cannot safely continue, we should order an organized return." Kaler shook his head. "A retreat will be interpreted as weakness." Celine Voss answered before anyone else could. "Refusing reality has never made it disappear." The room fell quiet again. Across the galaxy, independent news organizations had already begun asking difficult questions. Why were supply chains still unstable? Why were emergency maintenance requests being answered only by Terran engineers? Why were local governments quietly signing direct agreements with Earth instead of waiting for Council approval? Every answer pointed in the same direction, and people were beginning to notice. Deep beneath the Pentagon, Jonathan Mercer watched the growing list of incoming requests without showing the slightest hint of satisfaction. President Rebecca Hayes stood beside him with another report in her hands. 32 additional systems are requesting technical assistance. Jonathan scanned the document. "Approve every civilian request, even the ones that voted against us?" Rebecca asked. Jonathan looked up. "Especially those." Admiral Nathan Brooks smiled. "You are making it very difficult for them to keep calling us the problem." "That was always the idea," Jonathan replied. Hours later, Terran cargo vessels quietly departed the Sol system carrying replacement software, certified maintenance teams, and emergency engineering equipment. Every shipment carried the same instruction: civilian use only. No political conditions. No publicity. The people receiving those supplies did not hear speeches. They simply watched long, silent convoys arrive exactly when they needed them most. Back inside the Council capital, frustration had turned into open division. Several member worlds formally requested an emergency confidence vote in Chancellor Kaler's leadership. Others demanded immediate negotiations with Earth before the economic slowdown became permanent. Kaler refused every proposal. "If we invite humanity back now," he insisted, "the Council will never recover its authority." Celine slowly stood from her seat. Authority was never the foundation of this alliance. Kaler looked at her sharply. Then what was? She held his gaze without raising her voice. "Trust." Those single words lingered over the chamber longer than anyone expected. At that exact moment, the central communications display activated without warning. Every delegate turned toward the screen. The transmission did not come from Earth. It came from the governors of 12 member systems speaking together for the first time. Their spokesperson delivered a simple statement: "Our citizens need stability, not political pride. Effective immediately, we recognize all existing humanitarian and commercial agreements with Earth regardless of previous Council restrictions." One after another, more confirmations appeared beside the message. 15 systems. 21. 28. The number continued climbing. Kaler stared at the display in disbelief as the alliance he had spent decades building began making decisions without waiting for his permission. Jonathan Mercer quietly watched the same broadcast from Earth. Rebecca Hayes looked toward him. They are choosing. Jonathan nodded once. No, they are remembering that cooperation cannot be ordered. A secure signal suddenly appeared on Jonathan's private terminal. The sender identification contained only one name. High Chancellor Magnus Kaler. Jonathan opened the message and read it silently. There was no threat, no accusation, only a formal request for a private meeting inside the Grand Chamber. Brooks looked at Jonathan. Do you think he is finally ready to negotiate? Jonathan closed the message and slipped the terminal into his jacket. No, he said calmly. I think he is finally ready to listen. Jonathan Mercer entered the Grand Chamber through the same doors he had walked through days earlier, but everything had changed. The towering room was just as impressive. The stars still shimmered beyond the enormous windows, and the seats of the High Council remained arranged in a perfect circle. Yet the confidence that once filled the chamber had vanished. Delegates spoke in whispers. Advisors avoided eye contact. Even the cameras that broadcast every historic session seemed strangely quiet. Magnus Kaler stood beside the central podium instead of behind it. For the first time since Jonathan had met him, the Chancellor looked older than his years. Ambassador Mercer, Kaler began. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Jonathan nodded politely. I came because billions of civilians deserve stability. Kaler hesitated before continuing. The Council is prepared to discuss restoring humanity's voting rights and lifting all commercial restrictions. Jonathan placed a thin folder on the table between them. That is a beginning, not a solution. Several delegates shifted uneasily as Jonathan opened the folder. Inside were only a few pages. No impossible demands. No punishment. No revenge. Every emergency restriction against Earth will be withdrawn immediately. Every member world will retain the freedom to trade directly with humanity without political interference. Future Council sanctions will require independent review instead of a simple majority vote. Humanitarian infrastructure will remain politically neutral under all circumstances. Kaler slowly read each page. You are asking us to limit our own authority. Jonathan calmly replied, No, I am asking you to prevent this mistake from happening again. The chamber remained silent. Celine Voss finally stood. I support the proposal. One by one, other delegates rose from their seats. Some had opposed humanity before. Others had remained silent out of convenience. Today, they voted without speeches, without celebration. Every resolution that had stripped Earth of its rights disappeared from the official record. The sanctions were revoked. Commercial restrictions ended. Independent oversight became law. When the final vote appeared above the chamber floor, nobody applauded. There was nothing left to celebrate. Only a lesson too expensive to ignore. Magnus Kaler slowly removed the insignia from his ceremonial robe and placed it on the podium. I believe power meant convincing others that they needed us, he said quietly. I was wrong. Jonathan looked at him for a long moment before answering. Leadership is not measured by how many people obey you. It is measured by how many people still trust you when they have another choice. Kaler lowered his head. There was nothing to argue with because everyone in the room had already lived the proof. As Jonathan turned to leave, no guards escorted him. No reporters crowded the hallway. The chamber doors opened just as they had before, but this time every delegate remained standing in complete silence until he disappeared from view. Hours later, freight lanes reopened across the galaxy. Maintenance networks came back online. Hospitals received supplies on schedule. Families waiting for delayed shipments finally saw cargo vessels arrive. Life quietly began moving forward again, not because one civilization had defeated another, but because cooperation had returned where pride had failed. Back on Earth, Rebecca Hayes watched the final council broadcast from her office. Admiral Nathan Brooks smiled for the first time in days. We never fired a single shot. Rebecca nodded. We did not have to. Jonathan later found the blank page he had left behind during his first visit carefully preserved inside the council archives. Beneath his original sentence, someone had added one final line in different handwriting. Arrogance demands obedience. Respect earns partnership. Years later, students across dozens of worlds would study that crisis, not as the day humanity humbled the council, but as the day an entire galaxy finally understood that the strongest foundation is never fear. It is trust, quietly earned, patiently protected, and never mistaken for weakness again.